"You're dead." The words came out flat, matter of fact. "I buried you. I threw dirt on your coffin 17 years ago. Margaret was my best friend. How could you do that to me and your own son?" My voice was rising now, hysteria creeping in around the edges. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what I did to you." "What you did? Richard, what you did was die. Except you didn't, did you?" Talking, very much alive. The rain was coming harder now, but neither of us moved toward shelter. "How is this possible?" "The doctor pronounced you dead." This story begins at her best friend's funeral, where Evelyn suddenly sees the impossible, her husband, the man she buried 17 years ago. What starts in sorrow spirals into suspicion, betrayal, and a truth more devastating than death itself. And before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it truly helps support this channel. The rain drummed against the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church with the persistence of grief itself. I smoothed my black dress and stepped through the heavy oak doors, my heels clicking softly against the worn marble floor. The scent of lilies hung thick in the air, mingling with the dampness that clung to rain-soaked coats and umbrellas. I paused in the doorway, taking in the familiar faces scattered throughout the pews. Margaret's funeral had drawn a good crowd, though not as large as I had expected. 61 years of life should have filled more seats, I thought. But Margaret had grown more private in recent years, more distant. The casket sat at the front, surrounded by white chrysanthemums and pink roses, Margaret's favorites. My throat tightened. I had helped Margaret plant those very roses in her garden 20 years ago, back when our friendship felt as permanent as the seasons. "Mrs. Harper?" A gentle voice interrupted my thoughts. A young man in an ill-fitting black suit approached, his face earnest but unfamiliar. "I'm sorry for your loss. Margaret spoke of you often." "Thank you." I studied his face, searching for some connection to my friend. "How did you know Margaret?" "From the library. She volunteered there on Tuesdays." He shifted uncomfortably. "She was very kind to my daughter when we first moved to town." I nodded, though something twisted in my chest. Margaret had never mentioned volunteering at the library. Another small piece of her life that had remained hidden. How many Tuesday afternoons had Margaret spent there while I assumed she was home, tending to her garden or reading her romance novels? I made my way down the center aisle, nodding to neighbors and acquaintances. The Hendersons from Margaret Street. Dr. Reeves, who had treated both our husbands back in the day. Mrs. Kim from the grocery store where Margaret shopped every Friday morning. But there were others too. Faces I didn't recognize. A woman with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing pearls that caught the dim church light. An older man near the back, his eyes fixed on the casket with an intensity that seemed almost proprietary. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp October air. I slipped into the third pew, the same spot I'd occupied at my husband Richard's service 17 years ago. Margaret had sat beside me that day, a steady presence when the world felt like it was crumbling. Margaret had held my hand during the eulogy, passed me tissues when the tears came, and later helped me navigate the maze of condolences and casseroles that followed. "She was the best friend I ever had," Margaret had said about me at Richard's service, her voice breaking slightly as she addressed the gathered mourners. "They don't make them like Evelyn anymore." Now I sat alone, studying the program in my hands. Margaret Rose Halloway, 1963-2024. Beloved friend and neighbor. The sparse details felt inadequate, like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. Pastor Williams approached the podium, his weathered hands gripping the edges as he surveyed the congregation. "We gather today to celebrate the life of Margaret Rose Halloway, a woman who touched many hearts in her time with us." I closed my eyes and let the familiar cadence of his voice wash over me. I could see Margaret as she was 30 years ago, auburn hair catching the sunlight as she laughed at something David had said, her hands always busy with some project or another. Margaret had been there for every milestone in David's life. His first steps, his high school graduation, his wedding to Brittany. Margaret was the kind of friend who remembered birthdays, Pastor Williams continued, who brought soup when you were sick, who listened without judgment. True enough, I thought. Margaret had done all those things and more. She'd been the sister I never had, the confidant who knew all my secrets. When Richard died suddenly of a heart attack at 48, Margaret had been the one to help me through the darkest months that followed. "I don't know how to do this alone," I had whispered one night, sitting in Margaret's kitchen over cups of chamomile tea. "You're not alone," Margaret had replied, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You'll never be alone as long as I'm here." The promise had held for 17 years. Even when Margaret moved an hour away to Millbrook 15 years ago, we'd maintained our weekly phone calls, our monthly lunch dates. Though I had to admit, those visits had become less frequent lately. Margaret always seemed busy, distracted, full of vague explanations about doctor's appointments and errands. And she'd never once invited me to her new place in all those years. "Let us pray," Pastor Williams said, and I bowed my head with the rest of the congregation. But instead of praying, I found myself remembering the last conversation I'd had with Margaret, just 3 weeks ago. Margaret had called, her voice strangely hurried. "Evie, I need to tell you something," Margaret had begun, then stopped. "No, never mind. It's nothing important, are you sure? You sound upset." "I'm fine. Just tired. The doctors want to run some more tests, but you know how they are. Always looking for problems where none exist." Those had been among Margaret's last words to me. I had sensed something more beneath the surface, but I'd let it go. I'd always let things go with Margaret, trusted that our friendship was solid enough to weather any storm. Now I wondered what Margaret had really wanted to say. The service continued around me, but my attention drifted. I noticed David near the back, his tall frame easily visible above the other mourners. He'd driven down from Portland as soon as I'd called with the news. Good boy. Reliable, like his father had been. My gaze moved past my son to the unfamiliar faces again. The woman with the pearls was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The man in the back pew sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap with military precision. Something about his posture nagged at me. The way he held his shoulders, the tilt of his head. Familiar in a way that made my heart skip unexpectedly. I turned back to the front, trying to focus on Pastor Williams's words about eternal rest and heavenly reunions. But the unease remained, settling in my chest like a stone. When the service ended, mourners began filing past the casket to pay their final respects. I waited, letting others go first. I needed these last moments to gather myself, to find the right words for goodbye. The woman with the pearls approached Margaret's casket and placed a single white lily among the other flowers. Her movements were graceful, practiced, as if she'd done this before. As if she belonged here as much as I did. "Beautiful service," someone said behind me. I turned to see Mrs. Patterson, Margaret's next-door neighbor from her old house. Yes, it was. I managed a smile. Margaret would have appreciated the turnout. She was such a private person, especially these last few years. Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice. I hardly saw her after she moved to Millbrook. Shame, really. We used to chat over the fence every morning. She kept busy, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what Margaret had kept busy with. I suppose. Though I always wondered. Mrs. Patterson glanced around, then leaned closer. Well, it's probably nothing. But she used to have a gentleman caller. Older fellow, very distinguished. I saw him a few times over the years, always in the evenings. Thought maybe she'd found herself a companion. My stomach tightened. A gentleman caller? Oh, I'm sure it was innocent. Margaret was always so proper. But after Richard passed, I used to hope you might both find happiness again. Life's too short to spend it alone, don't you think? Before I could respond, Mrs. Patterson had moved on, leaving me with questions that felt like thorns in my throat. Margaret had never mentioned any man. In all our conversations about loneliness and growing older, Margaret had insisted she was content with her solitude. I had my great love, she'd always said when I gently suggested she might consider dating. Some people only get one. I was lucky to have had mine. I had assumed Margaret was referring to her college boyfriend, Robert, who'd died in Vietnam. But no, I wondered if there had been someone else. Someone recent. Someone Margaret had chosen to keep secret. I finally approached the casket, my legs unsteady. Margaret looked peaceful, younger somehow without the worry lines that had creased her face in recent months. The funeral director had done a good job with her makeup, bringing back the soft blush that had been absent during our last lunch together. "I'm going to miss you," I whispered, placing my hand on the cool mahogany. "I wish you'd told me whatever it was you were holding back. I wish we'd had more time." The lily's perfume was overwhelming up close, sweet and cloying. I stepped back, feeling suddenly dizzy. I needed air, needed to escape the weight of all these unspoken questions. As I turned toward the exit, my eyes swept across the remaining mourners. Most were gathering their things, preparing to head to the reception at the community center. But the man in the back pew remained seated, his head bowed as if in prayer. Something about the curve of his neck, the way his graying hair curled slightly at the collar, sent a shock of recognition through me. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. I blinked hard, certain my grief was playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, he was still there. Still achingly, impossibly familiar. The man lifted his head, and our eyes met across the length of the church. Time stopped. It was Richard, my Richard, older, grayer, but unmistakably the man who had been buried in Riverside Cemetery 17 years ago. The church spun around me like a carnival ride. I gripped the back of the pew in front of me, my knuckles white against the dark wood. This wasn't possible. Grief could make people see things, couldn't it? Hallucinations brought on by stress and sorrow and too many sleepless nights since Margaret's death. But the man, Richard, was rising from his seat now, his movements deliberate and careful. I knew that way of standing, the slight favor of his left leg from an old football injury. I knew the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was nervous, the way he was doing right now. Our eyes held across the church for a heartbeat longer. Then he looked away, moving toward the side door with quick, purposeful steps. "No," I whispered. My voice was swallowed by the murmur of other conversations, the rustle of coats and programs. "No, wait." I pushed past Mrs. Kim, who was speaking to Pastor Williams about the reception arrangements. "Excuse me, I'm sorry." The side door was already closing by the time I reached it. I burst through into the gray afternoon, rain immediately pelting my face and soaking through my thin dress. The church parking lot was half empty, cars pulling away in a steady stream. But there, near the old oak tree at the far edge of the property, I saw him, Richard Harper, my supposedly dead husband. He was walking quickly, his dark overcoat collar turned up against the rain. But he must have heard my footsteps on the wet pavement because he stopped. Turned. And my world tilted completely off its axis. It was him, 17 years older, silver threading through the brown hair I used to run my fingers through. Lines around the eyes that had once crinkled when he laughed at David's knock-knock jokes. But the same Richard who had kissed me goodbye on that last morning, who had promised to pick up groceries on his way home from work. The same Richard who had supposedly died 3 hours later in his office, clutching his chest as his heart gave out. "Evelyn." His voice was exactly as I remembered it. Warm, with that slight rasp from too many years of smoking in college. "You're dead." The words came out flat, matter of fact. "I buried you. I threw dirt on your coffin." He flinched as if I'd struck him. "Evelyn, please. I mourned you for 17 years. My voice was rising now, hysteria creeping in around the edges. 17 years, Richard. I wore black to David's wedding because I didn't think I deserved color anymore. I slept on your side of the bed because mine felt too empty. I kept your coffee mug in the dishwasher for 6 months because I couldn't bear to put it away." The rain was coming harder now, but neither of us moved toward shelter. Richard's face was pale, stricken. He looked older than his 65, older than he should have looked if he'd really been living all this time. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what I did to you." "What you did?" I laughed, a bitter sound that cut through the rain. "What you did. Richard, what you did was die. Except you didn't, did you? You're standing right here, breathing, talking, very much alive. A car honked in the distance, mourners still leaving the service. But we were alone out here under the oak tree, surrounded by 17 years of lies and the smell of wet earth. How? I demanded. How is this possible? The doctor pronounced you dead. I held your hand. It was cold, Richard. You were cold. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, I saw something I'd never seen before in all our years together: shame. The heart attack was real, he said. But I survived it. Dr. Langley, he was an old friend. He helped me disappear. Disappear. I repeated the word like it was foreign. Why would you need to disappear? Richard looked toward the church, where the last few stragglers were emerging into the rain. Not here. This isn't the place. Then where? The question came out as a sob. Where have you been, Richard? Where have you been living while I've been dying inside? Millbrook, he said so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the rain. Millbrook. Where Margaret had moved 15 years ago. Where Margaret had spent her final years, growing distant and secretive. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Margaret's vague excuses for not visiting. Her hurried phone calls. The way she'd changed the subject whenever I mentioned feeling lonely, mentioned how hard it was to grow old alone. Margaret, I breathed. Richard's face crumpled. She never wanted to hurt you. Neither of us did. It just happened. Happened? My voice cracked. What happened, Richard? Help me understand what could possibly justify letting me believe you were dead for 17 years. He ran his hand through his hair again, that familiar nervous gesture. But there was nothing familiar about the man standing in front of me. This stranger wearing my husband's face. We'd been seeing each other for years before the heart attack, he said. It started innocently enough. Coffee after your garden club meetings. Lunch when you were visiting your sister in Chicago. We never meant for it to become an affair. The word tasted like poison. You were having an affair with my best friend. We fell in love, Evelyn. I know how that sounds. I know it's not an excuse, but what? You thought faking your death was a better solution than divorce? Richard's shoulders sagged. You have to understand the position we were in. Margaret was your closest friend. Had been since college. And you trusted us both completely. If it had come out, it would have destroyed everything. Your friendship with her, your reputation in town. So you decided to destroy me instead. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly freezing. You let me believe I was a widow. You let me grieve and mourn and fall apart, all so you could run off with Margaret without anyone judging you. The heart attack gave us an opportunity, Richard said miserably. Dr. Langley said I was lucky to survive. Another few minutes and I would have died for real. It seemed like a sign. A sign. I stared at him, this man who had shared my bed for 23 years, who had held my hand during labor, who had taught our son to ride a bike. A sign that you should abandon your family? I thought it would be easier for everyone, he said desperately. Cleaner. You could grieve and move on. David could remember me as the father who loved him, not the father who left him for another woman. Easier. The word was a whisper now. Richard, do you have any idea what the last 17 years have been like for me? Do you know that David still visits your grave on your birthday? That he named his son after you? Richard's face went white. He has a son? A grandson you'll never meet. Because you're dead, remember? You chose to be dead rather than face the consequences of your actions. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain intensified. My hair was plastered to my head now, my black dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away from this ghost of my past. "Why are you here?" I asked. "Why now, at Margaret's funeral? Why risk everything to come here?" Richard's composure finally broke. His face twisted with grief, and for a moment he looked like the man I'd once loved. I couldn't stay away. "She's gone, Evelyn. Margaret is gone, and I couldn't let her go into the ground without saying goodbye." "You loved her that much?" The question hurt to ask, but I needed to know. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm sorry, but yes." The honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. 23 years of marriage, and he had never looked at me the way he was looking at nothing now, thinking of Margaret. "Did she love you?" I asked. "She said she did. But she never stopped feeling guilty about it. About what we'd done to you." Richard wiped rain from his eyes. "She wanted to tell you, especially these last few years. The guilt was eating her alive. She said the secret was killing her." His voice broke. 4 years ago, she couldn't take it anymore. She asked me to leave. Said she couldn't live with herself anymore. The guilt was destroying her from the inside. She just couldn't handle what we'd done to you. But you wouldn't let her tell me. I was afraid. Afraid of losing her, afraid of facing what I'd done. I was a coward, Evelyn. I've been a coward for 17 years. We stood in silence for a moment, the rain washing over us like tears. My mind was reeling, trying to process not just Richard's resurrection but the complete betrayal it represented. Margaret, my best friend, who had held my hand at the funeral, who had brought casseroles and tissues and comfort, had been lying to my face for decades. How could she do it? I asked. How could she sit with me all those nights when I cried about missing you, knowing you were alive? Knowing you were with her? She struggled with it every day. Some mornings she'd wake up determined to tell you everything. But then she'd think about how it would hurt you, how it would destroy your friendship, and she'd lose her nerve. So she chose to destroy me slowly instead. Death by 1,000 cuts. Richard stepped toward me, and I flinched away. Evelyn, please. Don't. I held up my hand to stop him. Don't come near me. Don't say my name like that, like you still care about me. I do care about you and David. I never stopped caring. No. I shook my head violently. You don't get to say that. You don't get to stand here and tell me you cared while you were playing house with my best friend for 17 years. You don't get to act like this was some noble sacrifice when it was just the coward's way out. You're right, he said quietly. You're absolutely right. I was selfish and cruel and I took the easy way. I destroyed everything good in my life because I was too weak to face the consequences of my choices. The admission should have felt like vindication, but it only made everything worse. I had loved this man completely, trusted him with my whole heart. And he had thrown it all away for an affair, then compounded the betrayal by letting me mourn him. "Does David know?" I asked suddenly. "Have you seen him? Talked to him?" Richard shook his head. "No. But I've watched him sometimes, from a distance. Saw him graduate from college, get married. But I never approached him." "You missed his whole life. Your own son's life." "I know." Richard's voice broke. "I know what I gave up. Not a day goes by that I don't regret it, but not enough to come back. Not enough to tell the truth." What would have been the point? By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. Too many years had passed. I'd already done the damage. I stared at him, this stranger with my husband's face. He was older now, softer around the middle, wearing clothes I didn't recognize. While I had spent 17 years in a mausoleum of memories, he had been living. Laughing with Margaret, sharing meals and conversations and the kind of intimate daily life that I had thought was buried in Riverside Cemetery. "I should go," Richard said when the silence stretched too long. "I shouldn't have come. I knew it was dangerous, but when I heard Margaret had died—" "How did you hear?" "The obituary. I still read the local paper online sometimes." Of course he did. He had been monitoring our lives from a distance, keeping tabs on the people he'd abandoned. The thought made my skin crawl. "She died alone, you know," I said. "Margaret. The neighbor found her 3 days later." 3 days, Richard. If you hadn't been hiding like a criminal, if you'd been able to be with her openly, maybe someone would have been there when she collapsed. The accusation hit home. Richard's face went gray, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I wanted to be there," he whispered. "I wanted to hold her hand, to tell her I loved her. But we weren't. We hadn't been together for years. She ended things between us 4 years ago. Said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore, couldn't keep betraying you. But I still loved her. I never stopped loving her, even after she sent me away. So she died thinking about that secret you made her keep. Died feeling guilty about a friendship she'd destroyed for a man who wouldn't even claim her publicly." "Stop," Richard said. "Please stop." But I couldn't stop. 17 years of suppressed rage was pouring out of me now, hot and unstoppable. "Did you think about me at all? When you were making your new life with her, did you ever wonder how David and I were doing? If I was lonely? If we were struggling?" "Every day," he said. "I thought about you every day. But not enough to come back. Not enough to tell me the truth and let me move on with my life instead of spending it mourning a ghost." "I'm sorry," Richard said desperately. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I know it's not enough, I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am." I looked at him for a long moment, this broken man who had once been my whole world. The rage was still there, burning bright, but underneath it was something else. Something that felt almost like relief. "I need to go," I said finally. "People will be wondering where I am." "Evelyn, wait." But I was already walking away, my heels clicking against the wet pavement. Behind me, I heard Richard call my name once more, but I didn't turn around. I had spent 17 years talking to a headstone. Now I knew the truth. I had been talking to myself all along. The rain was letting up as I reached the church steps, but I was soaked through. My carefully styled hair hung in wet strings around my face, and my dress clung uncomfortably to my skin. I probably looked like I'd been through a hurricane. Which, in a way, I had. David appeared at my elbow as I climbed the steps. "Mom? Where were you? I've been looking everywhere." I turned to study my son's face, Richard's eyes, Richard's stubborn chin. David had grown up believing his father was a hero who'd been taken too soon. How could I tell him the truth? How could I destroy that image along with everything else? "I needed some air," I said finally. The service was overwhelming. David's expression softened. "I know this is hard. You and Margaret were so close." Close. The word was laughable now. We had been close the way a spider and a fly were close. "Are you ready to go to the reception?" David asked. "Or we can skip it if you're not feeling up to it." I looked back toward the oak tree, but Richard was gone. Vanished again, like the ghost I'd thought he was. "No," I said, straightening my spine. "We should go. People will expect us to be there." As we walked toward David's car, I caught a glimpse of myself in the side mirror. I looked older than my 62 years, worn down by grief and shock. But there was something else in my reflection, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I looked like a woman who was finally, after 17 years, ready to stop living in the past. 3 weeks passed before I could bring myself to tell David what I'd seen at the funeral. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, pacing my kitchen floor, staring at the phone. How do you tell your son that his dead father is alive? How do you explain that everything he's believed about his family has been a lie? I finally called him on Wednesday evening, my hands shaking as I dialed his Portland number. "Mom?" David's voice was warm with concern. "How are you holding up? I've been worried about you since the funeral." "David, I need to see you. Can you come here this weekend? There's something we need to discuss." "Of course. Is everything okay? You sound strange." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "Just come, please. And don't bring Brittany or little Richie. This needs to be just us." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. Finally, David spoke, his voice careful. "Mom, you're scaring me." "I know. I'm sorry. Just trust me, please." Friday afternoon found us sitting in my living room, the same room where David had taken his first steps, where we'd opened Christmas presents. He perched on the edge of the sofa, his tall frame folded awkwardly, worry etched across features that looked so much like Richard's it made my chest ache. "What's this about, Mom? You've been acting strange all week." I sat across from him in Richard's old chair, a habit I'd never been able to break. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, highlighting the dust motes that danced between us like secrets waiting to be told. At Margaret's funeral, I began, then stopped. The words felt impossible, too large for my throat. What about it? I saw someone there. Someone who shouldn't have been possible to see. David leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Mom, grief can do funny things to people. Make them see, I saw your father. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of silence that seemed to expand forever. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, concern, something that might have been fear. Mom. His voice was gentle, the tone he'd used when little Richard had nightmares. Dad's been gone for 17 years. You know that. I thought I knew that. I stood up, began pacing to the window. The garden was overgrown, weeds choking the roses Margaret and I had planted together. But he was there, David. In the back pew. Older, grayer, but unmistakably your father. Okay. David's voice was carefully controlled. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you did see someone who looked like Dad. People have doppelgangers, right? Someone who just happened to resemble. He spoke to me. I turned to face my son, seeing my own desperate need to be believed reflected in his eyes. Called me by name. He knew things only your father would know. David was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That's not possible. I know how it sounds. I know you think I'm losing my mind. I don't think you're losing your mind. I think you're grieving. Margaret's death brought up a lot of old pain, and sometimes our brains try to cope by. David. I sat back down, leaning toward him. I spoke with him for 15 minutes in the rain. He told me things, about Dr. Langley, about the heart attack, about Margaret. The question hung in the air between us. This was the part I'd been dreading most, the revelation that would destroy not just David's image of his father, but his memories of the woman who had been like a second mother to him. They were having an affair, I said simply. For years. Before the heart attack, and after. David's face went white. That's insane. Margaret loved you. She was your best friend. I thought so too. I reached for the tissue box, my hands trembling. But it makes sense now. Why she moved to Millbrook 15 years ago. Why she never invited me to visit. Why she always seemed guilty whenever I talked about being lonely. This is crazy. David stood abruptly, running his hands through his hair, another gesture inherited from Richard. Even if someone did approach you at the funeral claiming to be Dad, even if they somehow knew personal details, I really wish that is the case, but he was your dad. This isn't happening, he whispered. I know it's hard to accept. I've had 3 weeks to process it, and I still can't quite believe it myself. David sank back onto the sofa, his face in his hands. If what you're saying is true, if Dad is really alive, then everything I've believed about him is a lie. Not everything. He loved you, David. That was real. Whatever else he did, however he betrayed us, his love for you was always genuine. Was it? David's voice was muffled by his hands. Because if he loved me, how could he let me think he was dead for 17 years? How could he miss my graduation, my wedding, the birth of his grandson? These were the same questions that had been tearing at me for days, the same accusations I'd hurled at Richard in the rain. I had no good answers. "He made a choice," I said carefully. "A selfish, cowardly choice. But people make terrible decisions sometimes, even when they love us." David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Where has he been all this time?" "Living with Margaret in Millbrook. Until 4 years ago, anyway. 4 years ago?" She ended it. The guilt became too much for her. She sent him away, but she still couldn't bring herself to tell me the truth. David was quiet for a long time, processing. I could see him working through the implications, the way his analytical mind tried to make sense of something that defied all logic and decency. "We need to find him," he said suddenly. "David, I don't know." "No, Mom. If he's alive, if he's really out there somewhere, then I need to see him. I need to hear this from him directly." "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why? Because it might hurt? Because learning that my father is a lying coward who abandoned his family might be painful." David's voice was rising, anger finally breaking through the shock. "It's too late to protect me from the pain, Mom. The damage is already done." He was right, of course. The truth was out now, spreading through our lives like cracks through ice. There was no going back to the comfortable lies we'd lived with. "Do you know where he is now?" David asked. "No, he disappeared after we talked. But I imagine he's still in the area somewhere. He was reading the local obituaries, keeping tabs on us." Jesus. David shook his head. "How do you even begin to process something like this? My father, who I've mourned for 17 years, has been alive this whole time. My mother's best friend was sleeping with my father behind her back. Everything I thought I knew about my family is wrong." I reached across the space between us and took his hand. His fingers were cold, trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry you have to go through this." Gosh, he looked at me with eyes that were suddenly much older. I had been carrying this knowledge alone for 3 weeks, and it had been crushing me. "I needed you to know. I couldn't carry this secret the way Margaret did. I couldn't lie to you for years, even to protect you." David squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you told me. I hate it, but I'm glad." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of revelation settling over us like dust. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, shadows lengthening across the garden where Margaret had once helped me plant roses. "There's something else," I said quietly. David looked at me with exhausted eyes. "More? I'm not sure I can take any more revelations today." He asked about you. "Your father. He didn't even know you had a son. He didn't know about little Richard?" I shook my head. 17 years of your life, David. Your college graduation, your wedding, the birth of your child. He missed it all by choice. And the worst part is, he could have been there. He could have been part of our lives this whole time, but he chose to hide instead. David stood up abruptly and walked to the mantelpiece, where photos of our family lined the shelf. Pictures of him as a child, his wedding day, little Richard's first birthday. In several of the older photos, Richard smiled back at us, frozen in time at 48 years old. I used to talk to this picture, David said, picking up a photo from our last family vacation before Richard's supposed death. When I got my first job, when I met Brittany, when Richard was born, I'd tell him about it. I felt so stupid talking to a photograph, but I needed him to know. He was watching, I said softly. From a distance. He saw your graduation, your wedding. He saw me, maybe, but he wasn't there. Never tried to contact me. David's voice cracked. Do you know what that means? It means he could watch me get married without wanting to be part of it. He could see me become a father without caring enough to meet his own grandson. The anger in David's voice was building now, hot and raw. I recognized it because I'd felt the same fury myself. How could he do that to you, Mom? How could he let you grieve for 17 years while he was alive and well, living with your best friend? I don't know, I whispered. I keep asking myself the same question. David turned back to face me, the photograph still clutched in his hands. And Margaret. God, Margaret. She held me at Dad's funeral. She told me stories about what a good man he was, how much he loved us. She comforted me when I cried. How could she do that, knowing he was alive? Knowing she was the reason he was gone? She was struggling too, I said, though the words felt inadequate. The guilt was eating her alive. Good. The vehemence in David's voice surprised us both. I'm sorry, but good. She should have felt guilty, they both should have. I understood his anger, but something in me still wanted to defend Margaret, even now. Decades of friendship doesn't disappear overnight, even when it's built on lies. She loved you, David. Whatever else she did, she genuinely loved you like a son. No. David shook his head firmly. Someone who loved me wouldn't have helped my father abandon me. Someone who loved me wouldn't have lied to my face for 17 years. He was right, of course. But my heart wasn't ready to accept that Margaret had been entirely false. Some part of me still needed to believe that our friendship had been real, at least in the beginning. We need to decide what we're going to do, I said, changing the subject before we could spiral deeper into recriminations. What do you mean? About your father. Do we try to find him? Do we confront him together? Or do we let sleeping dogs lie? David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photo in his hands. I need to see him, he said finally. I need to look him in the eye and ask him how he could do this to us. David, are you sure? Mom. I've spent 17 years mourning a man who was alive the whole time. I've named my son after a father who chose to abandon me. I deserve answers. I could see the pain beneath his anger, the hurt little boy who had never gotten to say goodbye to his father. Or hello again, for that matter. All right, I said. But we do this together. I won't let you face him alone. David nodded, setting the photograph back on the mantel. How do we find him? I'm not sure. He was living with Margaret in Millbrook, but she ended things 4 years ago. He could be anywhere now. What about Dr. Langley, the one who helped fake his death? I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd forgotten about him. He'd be in his 70s now, probably retired. But he might still be around. He might know where Dad is. The idea of confronting Dr. Langley, a man who had helped orchestrate the cruelest deception of my life, made my stomach turn. But David was right. If anyone knew where Richard was now, it would be him. "I'll call for information," David said, pulling out his phone. "See if there's a Dr. Langley still listed in the area." While David made his calls, I walked to the kitchen and put on the kettle. My hands were shaking again, and I needed something to do with them. The familiar ritual of making tea helped calm my nerves. Through the window, I could see Margaret's old house across the street. New owners had moved in 2 years ago, a young couple with small children. Sometimes I watched them playing in the yard where Margaret and I had once sat drinking lemonade, sharing gossip and dreams for the future. Had she been thinking about Richard during those conversations? Had she been counting the minutes until she could get away from me and back to him? "Mom?" David's voice interrupted my brooding. "I found him." I turned around, the tea forgotten. "Dr. Langley?" "He's listed in Millbrook, same town where Margaret lived." Of course he was. The conspirators had all stayed close together, maintaining their web of lies while I lived alone with my grief. "Should I call him?" David asked. I considered this. Part of me wanted to storm into Langley's office and demand answers. But another part of me was terrified of what we might learn. "Not yet," I said. "Let me think about this. Let me figure out what we want to say." David nodded, though I could see the impatience in his eyes. He wanted action, wanted to confront the people who had betrayed us. I understood the impulse, but I also knew that once we started down this path, there would be no turning back. "There's something else we need to consider," I said carefully. "What?" "Your family. Brittany and little Richard. This is going to affect them too." David's face clouded. "Brittany saw how hard it's been for me, missing my dad." "What will you tell her?" "The truth." His voice was firm. "I can't lie to my wife about something this big. And little Richard, he deserves to know that the grandfather he was named after is still alive." The thought of my 4-year-old grandson learning that his grandfather was alive but had chosen not to be part of his life was heartbreaking. How do you explain that level of rejection to a child? "Maybe we should wait," I said. "Until we know more. Until we've talked to your father." "No more waiting, Mom. No more protecting people from the truth. Look where keeping secrets got Margaret and Dad. It destroyed them. It destroyed us. I won't do that to my family." He was right, of course. Secrets were poison. They festered and grew until they consumed everything they touched. But that didn't make the truth any easier to bear. The kettle whistled, and I turned off the heat. Neither of us wanted tea anymore. "I keep thinking about all the times I wished he was still alive," David said quietly. "All the moments when I needed his advice, when I wanted to share something with him. My wedding day, when Richard was born, I missed him so much it physically hurt." "I know. But he was out there. He was alive and he could have been there, but he chose not to be. That's worse than death, Mom." Death is final, but this is abandonment." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with pain. Abandonment. That's what it was, stripped of all excuses and justifications. Richard had chosen to abandon his family rather than face the consequences of his actions. "I hate him," David said suddenly, the words exploding out of him. "God help me, I hate my own father." I crossed the room and pulled my son into my arms, the way I'd done when he was small and the world had hurt him. He was taller than me now, broader, but in that moment he felt like the heartbroken little boy who had cried at his father's funeral. "It's okay to hate him," I whispered. "It's okay to be angry, is it? Because part of me still loves him too, and that makes me feel crazy." Love and hate aren't opposites, David. They're two sides of the same coin. You can hate what he did while still loving the father you remember. We held each other in the fading light, two people trying to make sense of a betrayal so complete it defied understanding. Outside, the world went about its business, unaware that our entire reality had been shattered and was slowly being rebuilt, piece by painful piece. "We'll find him," David said eventually, pulling away. "We'll get our answers, and then what?" David's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked exactly like his father. "Then we decide whether he deserves our forgiveness." I nodded, though I wasn't sure forgiveness was possible. Some betrayals cut too deep, lasted too long. Some damage couldn't be undone. But we had to try. We owed it to ourselves, to little Richard, to the memory of the family we thought we'd been. We had to confront the lies and see if anything true remained underneath. The sun had set while we talked, leaving us in darkness punctuated only by the glow of streetlights. In a few hours, David would drive back to Portland and his own family. But the conversation wasn't over. It was just beginning. "I'll call Dr. Langley tomorrow," I said. "We'll start there." David nodded. "And Mom? Whatever we find out, whatever happens, we're in this together. You're not alone anymore." For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I felt a spark of something that might have been hope. I wasn't alone. I had my son, and together we would face whatever truth was waiting for us. The lies had ruled our lives for 17 years. It was time to take that power back. Dr. Langley's office sat on a quiet residential street in Millbrook, tucked between a bakery and a small bookshop. The building looked tired, its white paint peeling slightly at the corners, but the brass nameplate beside the door still gleamed. Dr. Harrison Langley, MD Internal Medicine. David and I sat in his rental car for several minutes, neither of us moving to get out. It had been a week since our conversation in my living room, a week of sleepless nights and careful planning. We'd rehearsed what we would say, how we would approach this man who had helped orchestrate the cruelest deception of our lives. "Are you ready for this?" David asked, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I looked at the modest building that housed so many answers. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this. We could still turn around. Go home. Pretend none of this happened." "Could you?" I asked. "Could you really go back to not knowing?" David was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No. I need to know the truth. All of it. We climbed out of the car and approached the entrance. The waiting room was small and outdated, with faded floral wallpaper and magazines from several years ago. A middle-aged receptionist looked up as we entered, her smile professional but tired. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But we need to speak with Dr. Langley. It's about Richard Harper." The woman's expression shifted, became wary. "I'm sorry, but Dr. Langley doesn't discuss his patients without." "Richard Harper supposedly died 17 years ago," David interrupted, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But we have reason to believe Dr. Langley helped him fake his death. I'm Richard's son, and this is his widow. We're not leaving until we get some answers." The receptionist stared at us for a moment, then picked up her phone. "Doctor? There are some people here asking about Richard Harper." She listened, then hung up. "He'll see you in a few minutes." We sat in uncomfortable silence, the weight of 17 years pressing down on us. I thought about Margaret, lying in her grave with secrets she'd never been able to tell. I thought about the wasted years, the loneliness, the grief that had shaped my entire adult life. "Mrs. Harper? Mr. Harper?" A voice called from the doorway. "Please come in." Dr. Harrison Langley was smaller than I'd expected, a thin man in his 70s with sparse white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like someone's grandfather, not a co-conspirator in an elaborate deception. His office was warm and cluttered, filled with medical journals and family photos. He gestured to 2 chairs across from his desk, his movements careful and deliberate. "Please, sit," he said, settling into his own chair with a heavy sigh. "I wondered when this day would come." "Then you know why we're here," David said. Dr. Langley nodded slowly. "Your father came to see me 2 weeks ago. After Margaret's funeral. He was distraught. He told me what happened, that Evelyn had seen him. He looked at me with something that might have been regret. I told him he should have come clean years ago." "But you helped him," I said. "You helped him fake his death and disappear." "I did." Dr. Langley's voice was quiet, heavy with years of guilt. "It was the worst decision I ever made as a doctor. As a human being." "Why?" David leaned forward, his voice desperate. "Why would you do something like that?" Dr. Langley was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father was my oldest friend, we'd known each other for decades. When he had the heart attack and barely survived, when he came to me desperate and broken, talking about the affair and the impossible situation he'd created." He shook his head. "I thought I was helping him. We thought it would be cleaner, easier for everyone." "Easier?" My voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what you put me through? What you put David through?" "I know." Tears were gathering in the old man's eyes. "I've regretted it every single day for 17 years. But by the time I realized what a terrible mistake we'd made, it was too late. The lie was too big, had gone on too long." "Where is he?" David asked abruptly. "Where is my father now?" Dr. Langley hesitated. "I don't know if I should." "Doctor," I said, my voice firm. You've kept his secrets long enough. We deserve to face him. We deserve answers." After a long pause, Dr. Langley reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a piece of paper. "He's staying at the Millbrook Inn, room 237. Has been since Margaret ended things 4 years ago. He's been lost, I think. Adrift without her, but too ashamed to come home." I took the paper with trembling hands. After 17 years, I finally had an address for my supposedly dead husband. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Langley said quietly. "He's not well. The guilt, the isolation, the drinking, it's taken a terrible toll. He's not the man you remember, Evelyn. Either of you." "Well," David said harshly, "he should suffer for what he did to us." Dr. Langley flinched. "Perhaps. But when you see him, remember that he's suffered too. Not the way you have, not nearly enough, but he has paid a price for his choices." We left the office in silence, driving the few blocks to the Millbrook Inn in a haze of anticipation and dread. The inn was a small, shabby place that had probably been charming once but now just looked tired and forgotten. "Room 237, David said as we climbed the narrow stairs. "Mom, are we sure about this?" I wasn't sure about anything anymore. But I knew we had to see this through. David knocked on the door. "Dad? It's David. And Mom's here too." The silence stretched so long I wondered if Richard was even there. Then we heard footsteps, slow and hesitant, and the sound of a chain being undone. The door opened, and I saw my husband for the second time in 17 years. Dr. Langley had been right. He wore a rumpled shirt and jeans that hung loose on his diminished frame. His eyes, once bright and confident, looked haunted. "David," he whispered, staring at his son with wonder and pain. "My God, look at you." "Look at me?" David's voice was sharp. "You've been looking at me, haven't you? From a distance. At my graduation, my wedding. Watching like some kind of ghost." Richard flinched but stepped back to let us in. The room was small and depressing, with a narrow bed, a worn armchair, and not much else. Empty bottles lined the windowsill, and the air smelled of alcohol and despair. "I know you have questions," Richard said, closing the door behind us. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be." "Do we?" I asked. "Do we have the right to be angry that you let us think you were dead for 17 years? That you destroyed our lives for an affair?" Richard sank into the armchair, looking older than his 65 years. "I don't know where to begin. How to explain what I did." "Start with why," David said. "Why did you choose Margaret over your family?" "I didn't choose her over you." Richard's voice was hoarse. "That's not how it happened." "Then how did it happen?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you decided your affair was more important than your wife and son." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "It started innocently enough. Coffee after your garden club meetings, Evelyn. Margaret would stay behind to help clean up, and we'd talk. She was lonely, I was feeling neglected." He looked up at me with pleading eyes. "I know how that sounds. I know it's no excuse." "You're right," I said. "It's no excuse." It wasn't supposed to become what it became. But Margaret, she understood me in a way I didn't think anyone could. We talked for hours about books, about life, about dreams we'd never shared with anyone else. While I was at home, taking care of your son and your house and believing I had a faithful husband, I said. Yes. Richard's voice broke. While you were being the perfect wife and mother, I was betraying everything we'd built together. David stood up abruptly and began pacing the small room. So you fell in love with Mom's best friend. That's terrible, but it happens. People get divorced. Why the elaborate deception? Why let us think you were dead? Because I was a coward. Richard's admission was barely audible. When I had the heart attack, when I was lying in that hospital bed, I realized what I'd done. I'd destroyed my marriage, betrayed my best friend's trust, torn apart two families. And I couldn't face it. So you chose to disappear instead of dealing with the consequences, I said. Dr. Langley said I was lucky to survive. Another few minutes and I would have died for real. It felt like it was a sign. A chance to start over without hurting you any more than I already had. Without hurting us? David's voice rose. Dad, do you know what your death did to us? Do you know that Mom couldn't sleep in her own bed for months? That I cried myself to sleep for a year thinking I'd never see you again? Richard's face crumpled. I thought it would be easier. I thought you'd grieve and heal and move on. Instead of grieving and healing and moving on from a divorce? I asked. Richard, widowhood and divorce are not the same thing. You took away our right to choose how to feel about you. I know. Richard wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. I know I was selfish and wrong. But by the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. Years had passed. You'd both moved on. I couldn't just show up and destroy the peace you'd found. Peace? I laughed bitterly. Richard, I haven't known peace in 17 years. I've been carrying your ghost around like a weight on my chest. Every decision I've made, every relationship I've avoided, every moment of joy I've denied myself, it was all because I thought I was honoring your memory. I didn't know. Because you didn't want to know. David stopped pacing and faced his father. You were too busy playing house with Margaret to care about what you'd left behind. That's not true. Richard's voice was desperate. I thought about you every day. Both of you. I drove by the house sometimes, just to see if you were okay. I watched your graduate, saw him get married. But you never approached me, David said. Never tried to contact me. Your own son. What would I have said? Sorry I let you think I was dead, but I'm actually living with your mother's best friend. How do you come back from something like that? You don't, I said quietly. You don't come back from it. You live with the consequences of your choices, like an adult. Richard was crying now, silent tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. I lost everything. My family, my self-respect, my sense of who I was. Even Margaret, she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. She ended it 4 years ago, said she couldn't keep betraying you, Evelyn. But she never told me the truth either, I said. She died with that secret. She wanted to. God, how she wanted to. Especially these last few years. She'd call you and lose her nerve. She'd write letters and tear them up. The guilt was eating her alive. Good. The word slipped out before I could stop it, surprising me with its vehemence. Richard looked at me with wounded eyes. She loved you, Evelyn. Whatever else you think of her, she genuinely loved you. That's why she couldn't tell you. She couldn't bear to see the hurt in your eyes. So instead she let me live a lie for 17 years. I stood up, suddenly unable to sit still. She let me mourn a husband who was alive. She comforted me in my grief while sleeping with the man I was grieving. That's not love, Richard. That's cruelty. I know. Richard's voice was broken. I know what we did was unforgivable. Wait, are you now asking for forgiveness? David asked. The question hung in the air between us. Richard looked from his son to his wife, his eyes desperate and pleading. I'm dying, he said quietly. The words hit like a physical blow. I sank back into my chair, suddenly dizzy. What? David whispered. Liver disease. The drinking, the stress. Dr. Langley says I have maybe 6 months. Richard's voice was calm now, accepting. I don't want to die with this between us. I don't want to go to my grave knowing that the 2 people I loved most in the world hate me. But we do hate you, David said, though his voice had lost its edge. At least, I do. Richard nodded. I understand. I hate myself too. I looked at this broken man who had once been my husband, my partner, the father of my child. The anger was still there, burning bright, but underneath it was something else. Not forgiveness, I wasn't ready for that yet. But maybe the beginning of understanding. You said you loved us most, I said carefully. But you loved Margaret enough to destroy us for her. I thought I did. Richard's voice was barely audible. But love doesn't destroy the people you care about. What I felt for Margaret, it was selfish, desperate. It wasn't love. Then what was it? Escape. From responsibility, from growing older, from the mundane realities of marriage and parenthood. Margaret made me feel young again, important. She saw me the way I wanted to see myself. While I saw you as you really were, I said. Yes. And I couldn't face that truth. David had been quiet during this exchange, staring at his father with a mixture of anger and something that might have been grief. Do you want to know about your grandson? He asked suddenly. Richard's face brightened for the first time since we'd arrived. Please. His name is Richard. We call him Richie. He's 4 years old, and he loves dinosaurs and firefighters. He asks about his grandfather sometimes, the grandfather he was named after. I tell him stories about the man I thought you were. What kind of stories? Good ones. About how you taught me to ride a bike, how you helped me with my science fair projects. How you made Mom laugh until she cried. David's voice was thick with emotion. I told him his grandfather was a hero who died too young. Richard closed his eyes, pain etched across his features. I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry I missed all of it. Your graduation, your wedding, Richie's birth. I threw away the most important things in my life for something that wasn't even real. The affair was real, I said. No. Richard shook his head. The excitement was real. But love? Real love doesn't ask you to betray the people you've promised to protect. Real love doesn't demand you become someone you're not. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 17 years settling between us. Outside, I could hear traffic passing by, people going about their normal lives while ours lay in pieces around us. "What do you want from us?" I asked finally. Richard looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but hopeful. "I want to tell Richie about his grandfather myself. I want him to know that I loved him even though I never got to meet him." "And what else?" "I want." Richard's voice broke. "I want to believe that maybe, someday, you might remember something good about the man I used to be." I looked at David, seeing my own struggle reflected in his eyes. This broken man in front of us had destroyed our lives, had stolen 17 years from us. But he was also the man who had held me during labor, who had taught our son to throw a baseball, who had once loved us enough to build a family. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "About letting you meet Richie. But I'm not ready to forgive you. I may never be ready." Richard nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I understand. That's more than I deserve." David stood up slowly, his movements stiff and uncertain. "I need some air. I'll wait outside." After he left, Richard and I sat alone in the suffocating silence of that small room. 23 years of marriage, 17 years of lies, and this was how it ended, in a shabby hotel room that smelled of whiskey and regret. "I did love you, Evelyn," Richard said quietly. "Maybe not well enough, maybe not the right way, but I did love you." "I know." My voice was barely a whisper. "That's what makes it so much worse." I stood to leave, then turned back one more time. Margaret was right to feel guilty. You both were. What you did to us, to David especially, it was unforgivable. "I know. But she died trying to protect what was left of our friendship. And you're dying trying to make amends. Maybe that means something." Richard looked up at me with desperate hope. "Does it?" I considered this, looking at the man who had been my whole world and my greatest betrayal. "I don't know yet. But maybe it means we can find a way to let go." I walked to the door, my hand on the handle. "Goodbye, Richard." "Evelyn?" His voice stopped me. "Will you tell David? Tell him I'm proud of the man he became? Tell him his grandfather would have been proud too?" I nodded, not trusting my voice, and left him alone with his ghosts. Outside, David was leaning against the car, his face turned toward the sky. When he saw me, he straightened up. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment, taking inventory of my heart. The anger was still there, but it felt different now, cleaner somehow. Less consuming. "Empty," I said finally. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing." David nodded. "He's really dying?" "I think so. He looks like a man who's given up." "Good." But David's voice lacked conviction. We drove home in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. As we pulled into my driveway, I caught sight of Margaret's old house across the street. The new owners had planted different flowers in the front yard, bright yellows and reds that Margaret never would have chosen. "Mom?" David's voice interrupted my reverie. What do we do now? I looked at my son, this good man who had been shaped by loss and lies but had somehow emerged whole and decent despite it all. We live, I said simply. We stop letting their betrayal define us. We take back our lives. David nodded slowly. And Dad? Do we let him meet Richie? The question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that his grandfather faked his death? How do you protect a child from the harsh realities of adult selfishness? Maybe, I said, but on our terms. If we do it, it's for Richie, not for your father. And you? Will you see him again? I thought about Richard, alone in that depressing room with nothing but regret for company. Part of me wanted to let him die as he had lived these past 17 years, isolated and consumed by his choices. But another part of me, a part that surprised me with its strength, wanted something different. I might, I said. Not to forgive him, but to say goodbye properly. To close the chapter on our marriage the way it should have been closed 17 years ago. David reached over and squeezed my hand. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. As we sat in the car in front of the house where I'd raised my son and mourned my husband and lived on lies, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness, exactly, but possibility. The future, which had been frozen in amber since Richard's supposed death, suddenly felt open again. You know what? I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. I think I'm ready to stop being a widow. David smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks. What does that mean? It means I'm going to plant new flowers in the garden. It means I'm going to clean out your father's things from the closet. It means I'm going to stop talking to a headstone and start talking to the living. I looked at Margaret's old house one more time, then turned toward my own front door. There would be more difficult conversations ahead, more decisions to make about forgiveness and family and how to move forward, but for the first time in 17 years, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of away from it. Come on, I said to David, getting out of the car. Let's go home. The word felt different now. Not like a mausoleum of memories, but like a place where new stories could be written. Where a grandmother could teach her grandson about resilience and truth. Where a mother and son could rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty instead of lies. As I walked up the front steps of the house I'd shared with a ghost for 17 years, I felt the weight of the past beginning to lift from my shoulders. Richard Harper had stolen enough of my life. I wasn't going to let him have any more. The sun was setting behind me, casting long shadows across the porch. But inside, I would turn on the lights. I would make tea. I would call my grandson and hear about his day. I would live. The betrayal would always be part of my story, but it didn't have to be the ending. Margaret and Richard had written the first chapters of this deception, but I got to choose how it concluded. And I chose healing. I chose truth. I chose life. The door closed behind us with a soft click, shutting out the past and opening onto whatever came next. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more heartwarming stories to enjoy.